So, hello everybody. Thank you so much for connecting. Welcome to this new Zoom session with, first of all, of course, a happy new year to everybody from me and also from Pierre Bodachars, who's also connected to the session. And today we'd like to present to you the platform we've been creating the last 3 years for Microport. It's called the Microport CRM. Microportacademycrm.com. I will show you this, and I will just show you a bit the website that we have been building, and which is now quite complete, actually. There's still some modules we're going to make, but there's already a lot of content on there. And I'd like to make use of the platform to show you a couple of cases, to show you and discuss a bit about ICDs of the Microport brand. Of course, I realize that outside of France and surely in the States, the Microport is a very small company still. You won't see a lot of ICDs, maybe you haven't even seen any. But I think it's very interesting to see what another platform looks like, what the differences are between Microport devices and maybe other companies, why certain decisions are made, why certain things are better, why certain other things are not better at all. This could be very interesting, even if you don't see a lot of ICDs. And I'll also try to concentrate on those people who will maybe do a once in a year box change for Microport. That's also interesting to therefore know a little bit how the platform is working. So I'm going to share my screen to be able to show the platform, what it looks like. So this is the site. Please don't hesitate to activate your microphone to ask me any questions or put anything into the chat. We can discuss those things. Also on the site, if you are able to connect, that of course would be very interesting for us to have some more people on the platform to learn. And also, if you find anything out of the ordinary, or if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to click on the contact button to contact me immediately using this, and we can try to improve the modules. So the idea is that you create a free account, and then you can choose one of those modules. So today we have an ECG platform, which is quite extensive. Then pacemaker, ICD, and CRT are the modules which are now finished. Of course, using a Microport platform, but I always try to have some basics also interesting for other types of companies. But of course, the tracings which are shown are those of Microport. Now, if you go to the ECGs, you can see that it's quite complete. We have some basics. Normal ECG is already quite a lot of tracings. And then depending on what kind of pathology, so for example, conduction disorders, you can go to AV block, and here there's a lot of tracings. And the idea is always to have a tracing, and then with short clinical description, you can click on the tracing to zoom it. And then if you go down, there is a question which you need to answer. Let me see if I have this correct. And then at the end of the case, there will be most of the times the tracing shown what's going on with some schematic and some explanation, which can be quite a lot, quite detailed, but also take-home messages. So this is what we really like to have on this platform, is case-based learning. So the ECG platform is already quite extensive, but today we of course want to focus on ICDs. Here you can see that there are different chapters. In the beginning, it starts with basic introduction, some history, which could be interesting for a few. I always love to know how these devices were developed. So if you have time for that, that would be interesting. Of course, some basics about leads and what the ICD looks like from the inside could interest you. And then one of the most important things for ICDs are, of course, the indications, Well, obviously you will just be guided through the ESC guidelines, which we use in Europe. But I tried to really summarize these guidelines into these topics, because I realized that this is a PDF with over 100 pages. So we're not going to all go through that. So I tried to summarize it on this module. And then if you go back to ICD, there are some videos about how to interrogate this type of device, which I will do a little bit live later. And then some chapters: counters, therapies, discrimination, and oversensing. And for every chapter, there's also how the algorithms are working, which you can find directly here on the submenu on the left. So pacemaker and ICD, and now also CRT, the videos, simulator cases. So what are simulator cases? This is the last chapter. This is actually quite, could be quite fun. Maybe we can start with one of those simulator cases where you will basically have the programmer screen on your own screen at home, and you can check it out. You can click around and answer some questions. So this, for example, is what we call a sim case. So this is a 72-year-old man implanted with a dual chamber defibrillator. So the ULIS is the newest platform for primary prevention, because he had ischemic heart disease with a decreased ejection fraction of around 30%. And I implanted this patient, and actually just after implantation, he was not in the operating theater anymore. I did a device check, and I found this overview screen. Well, if you're not used to Microport programmers, of course, it gets some taking used to handle all the information, because I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, maybe easier for you to see on small screens, that you can realize that there's a lot of information in there. So there is the running EGM. Then on the top left, there is some lead information and battery information. So here, this is a really new device. So there is not yet a prognosis of how many years the device will work. In this case, both on voltage. For Microport, it's a bit different than the other companies, because a shock lead impedance is only given when there is actually a shock performed. So this means that there has not been any shocks in this patient, which makes sense because he had just been implanted. And as we know, most centers, like in our center, we don't induce ventricular arrhythmia anymore to test an endovascular ICD. So here there are the latest lead measurements with P and the R waves, which are okay. I mean, maybe the atrial lead would be should be a little bit higher, but it's acceptable with very nice thresholds under 1 volt. We have impedances which are normal, and there is which you would maybe call a shock coil impedance, but it's a little bit, as I already said, a little bit different in Microport devices. So this is a paced impedance, which is a bit higher, but so it's normal for this brand. And then on the right, you will have even more information. You will have the lower rate and the upper tracking rate. You will have the pacing mode, which is here the SAFER mode, which is very similar to VP suppression in Biotronic, or MVP in Medtronic, or VIP in Abbott devices, or Rhythm IQ in Boston. So we have the pacing mode, which makes which tries to avoid unnecessary RV pacing, which is also available in ICDs. Here we have the sensitivity, which is always programmed nominally at 0.4 millivolts. So maybe a bit higher than in Medtronic devices. Really not recommended to change it at any moment. Like for most ICD manufacturers, everything is built to work with 0.4. If you want to change this parameter, you really had to think twice. Maybe better to change another parameter, or better to change the lead. And then we have the pacing, or the tachycardia zones, so the VT zones and the VF zones. See, we have a slow VT zone, which is here on, but there are no therapies, so this is more of a monitor zone. Here we have the VT zone between 180 and 220, which is very close to what's recommended. This is what we used to program in our hospital in Bordeaux. But I will show you the guidelines a little bit later. So this is the VT zone. Then there are 6 bursts programmed. I like to program 6 bursts. Maybe we can talk about that a little later. And then maximal shocks only, of course, in the VT zone. This is now also the recommendations for any ICD. And then we have the VF zone, which is a bit funny because there seems to be a button which is a little bit more narrow than this button for the therapies, meaning that the shocks are similar, but there is a fast VT zone between 220 and 255 beats per minute, which is it's actually in the VF zone, but when the tachycardia meets certain criteria, of course, the rate, so being between 220 and 255, and it's stable, then it will also perform ATP1 or ATP2 therapy. So in this case, which is classically a single burst. So you are, I think, if you will look at other companies, we're used to seeing a burst during or before the charge. Well, in Microport devices, it's a bit different. We can program any amount of bursts. In our practice, we usually have 1, but only when arrhythmias in the VF zone are stable, which makes sense, right? Because we know that many tachyarrhythmias, which are faster than 220 beats per minute, are actually VT. This is why in the VF zone in Medtronic device, we see a lot of bursts which are successful, because actually a lot of those tachyarrhythmias are VT. So they said, Microport, they say, well, let's not do a burst during or before charge just to see if it works. No, let's be a bit smarter than this. Let's try to see if it's actually VT, and we're using a stability criteria for that. So lots of times that works. And of course, sometimes when the VT is unstable, it doesn't, because it's quite a strict criteria. It means that of the preceding cycles, they need to be within 35 milliseconds. So it's quite a strict criteria. So then we have another screen, which is a sub-screen, which shows a lot of information, which is the statistics screen. Here we see how much atrial and ventricular pacing there is, how long the device has been in mode switch, the number of mode switches, and then there's some kind of Excel type table going on with all the therapies with or without deleterious ATP and shocks. We see for every episode whether there has been treatment or not. I can already inform you that if you have VF episodes which are not treated, that's of course really a red flag. You need to check what's going on there, because sometimes it's noise. And then also for all the zones, so for VT, slow VT, so other zones means supraventricular tachycardia. So here the discrimination has decided it's fast, but it's not VT, so it's labeled accordingly. And here we can see that whether they have how many have been occurring, and if they have maybe had treatment after or not, because discrimination also is a bit different in Microport devices. They can change their mind throughout the episode. So this is a lot of information, but the funny thing is now you had a lot of time to look at this screen. So far, I think most of you won't have seen anything out of interest or out of the case. Is there anything peculiar? If you've seen anything just strange, please put it in the chat or open your mic, because actually when I saw this screen after implantation, I was quite worried. I was not happy at all, and nothing to do with programming or or with these numbers we're seeing, but more with the tracing we see on top. Well, if you don't have an idea yet, I can help you a little bit. So let's do some tests. So of course, first we do some impedance tests, nothing out of the ordinary. Then we do some sensitivity tests. So let's do DDI 30 is always the standard for Microport, which makes sense. And then we see this. So we here see on top the atrial channel, and on the bottom we see the ventricular channel, and we see the markers and the associated millivolts at the bottom. Anybody know what's going on here? Sharing the stress with me when looking at this programmer screen just a short while after implantation. Let me see if there's anybody I can ask. Jan Charton,
Yes.
are you there?
Hello, yes.
Maybe I already shown you this case, huh? But
maybe.
What do you think?
I think there is a problem with the actual leads.
Oh yeah.
See that EGMs are on time with only a VS, a V-sense. And my first hypothesis would be that the actual leads is displaced.
Yeah.
Or, yeah.
Yeah, I think, I think we already have the diagnosis. So we see that the EGM of the atrium is almost 100% morphologically similar and also in timing than with the ventricle. We can maybe go a little bit further and do some testing, but not sure we will learn a lot more. So if we do ventricular pacing in DOO mode, so we pace both leads, we won't learn a lot because we don't know what is capturing what, right? But again, the EGMs are very similar. So we could also do VOO pacing. And we see again that if pacing the ventricular lead, the atrial channel looks really similar. So, and also looks like a ventricular capture, right? So we are really proving here that the atrial lead is in the ventricle. So just for the fun of it, we can do atrial pacing. Of course, not in DAO mode, but more significant would be to do it in AOO mode. And again, we see that if we do atrial pacing, meaning atrial pacing on the atrial channel, we have ventricular capture. So we have most proof. So I had to call back this patient to reposition the atrial lead. As you know, it happens sometimes. We do vigorous testing to check if the atrial lead is nicely positioned into the atrium, and if there's a capture, and everything was fine, as you can see in the settings. But here we can see appreciate the Microport ICD with two leads. We have a ventricular lead, which is going into the right ventricle. And here, just alongside it, we have an atrial lead, which is really close to the tip of the defibrillator lead. So we needed to reposition. I'm just clicking because, of course, it's not, I just wasn't trying to win some time. So I'm not answering all the questions. I'm sorry for that. So here we have the programmer screen just after, and you can now appreciate the atrial sensed markers on the EGM on top. And if we do sensitivity tests, we can also see the more normal atrial EGM with atrial sensing and ventricular sensing just at the same time. And then if we do checkup next day of the X-ray of the chest, we can appreciate that now the atrial lead is where it should be. So this is just an example of one of those simulator cases which I've been building for not only RICD, but also for pacemaker and CRT, of course. So now I'm going to go back to ICD, go back a bit more to the basics. So I want to show you some tracings and talk to you about how to program on a Microport ICD, and also talk a little bit about the guidelines. So Here we have a 66-year-old man who was implanted with a dual chamber ICD. Again, this is secondary prevention, ischemic heart disease, infarction, low ejection fraction, and narrow QRS complexes. So he's not a CRT candidate. So here we see the interrogation screen. Just put it in the middle like this. And now we see that there are some warnings. Well, this has to do because of the episodes which have been filling up this table. We see here episodes in the VT zone and episodes in the VF zone, which have been treated. If we look at programming, it's a bit similar to the first case, with the zones a little bit different, but still a VT zone with some bursts, ramps, and then maximum output shocks. So let's check out this one of those episodes. So we can see that here. Actually, what I'm going to do to make it a little bit more easy is to go directly to the patient on the programmer. So here we see this this patient, and then we can go to what I first like to do if patients come in is to test the leads, because it's a lot easier to interpret the episodes when you know that the leads are functioning properly. So let's just say that we did that. Then we go to our arrhythmias, and we see here the first episode. So of course, as we suspected on the overview screen, there are a few episodes which are registered into the memory of the device. But let's go just focus on this one. It's the VF episode, which occurred with treatment of a shock. So here we see the tachogram with intervals. Mostly we're used to look at a different way, meaning with intervals and not with the rate. But Microport devices, they like to show it in the beats per minute and not in milliseconds. But you can flip it and switch around if you want to. They also like to make use of pink little screens with a lot of different colors, which can be a little bit more difficult because here you have some kind of dark pink on lighter pink background, which makes it a bit difficult sometimes to see. But nevertheless, we can easily appreciate that there's here a slow rhythm going on. I don't know if it's paced or not. Seems a bit fixed, so it's possible. Here we already see some ectopy. We see that some red dots, which are ventricular, they have sometimes some faster heart rates, so fast beats. So these are probably ventricular extrasystoles. Same for the atrium sometimes. So here already something going on. But of course, the interesting part starts here, where the ventricle suddenly jumps into the dark pink zone, which is the VF zone, which shows very, very fast ventricular events. And then if we go to the second part, here soon there is a diagnosis of VF, and then there's a bunch of time, now a whole lot of cycles before the delivery of the shock. And this is of course due to two reasons. First of all, well, the battery, the capacitors needs to charge. So to deliver a couple of dozens of joules, the ICD has the need to dump the energy from the battery into the capacitors. So this is of course one of the reasons. But the other reason is also that for every company, but certainly for Microport and also comparable Boston Scientific devices, when there is a diagnosis made, doesn't necessarily mean that the therapies are directly delivered. There is, it's not called the duration, as is the case for Boston Scientific devices, but it's more, it's called the persistence, meaning that there needs to be a couple of cycles before the first therapy will be delivered, and in this case, in a very fast VF. and then of course this will be a shock. So let's go to the EGM. I mean, we already have the diagnosis here, so it's probably VF. The shock has been successful because we see return to a slow rate. But of course, we like to go and check out the EGM. So if I go back to the tachogram and I put my yellow marker where it interests me, so it's here, right here in the beginning of the arrhythmia, then we can go back to the EGM and it will show me the electrogram at that moment. And it kind of confirms what we are suspecting. It's a truly VF, which is starting here. So we can also zoom to better appreciate the signals. We can change the gain, so we can blow up the signals. Not really necessary in this case. And we can also zoom on the x-axis, having a bit more space for all the markers in the EGM. So can sometimes facilitate the interpretation of the episode. So here we see atrial channel on top. We see atrial paced events, AP, and we also see ventricular paced events, VP. So this looks like DTT mode with A pacing and V pacing. And then suddenly there is the onset of fast ventricular events, which starts, I guess, here, because already this, if I can call it a QRS, it looks a little bit different than the event here. Please, may I remind you that we're looking at the near field channel. So the morphology of the signal is not as accurate as on the far field channel, which we often don't have in Microport devices. But still, we can appreciate it's different, and it's also early. And it actually falls within a refractory period after atrial pacing. So what the device is going to do, because not sure whether this is a true ventricular event, or maybe it's some kind of far field oversensing of atrial pacing, it's going to pace the ventricle anyway, which is called safety pacing. So this is why we have these funny markers here. So it's not very important for this case, but just so you know why these markers look a bit funny. Now, we have the onset of a sudden and very fast arrhythmia, which is on the ventricular channel and not at all on the atrial channel. The atrial rhythm continues a bit like before, and then we see that that here there's something going on. So of course, like in every company, there is a counter algorithm looking for ventricular arrhythmia. So how does it work in Microport devices? It's maybe a bit similar to Boston, where it's X out of Y counter. It's always 6 out of 8 for Microport devices. And yes, you can change it, and no, you should never change it. Because again, all the ICD algorithms are based on this 6 out of 8. And if you change this, there's a lot of things changing, not only the detection of arrhythmia, but also discrimination, for example. So you should not change this. So 6 out of 8, meaning that this little arrow here means that it's the 6th fast event out of a sliding window of 8 events. So this is a 6th, and then that means that this is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And indeed, this cycle is fast, but it's not in the VF zone. This one is in the VF zone, and this is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of a sliding window of 8. And therefore, the diagnosis, the initial diagnosis of VF is made. And like I already said, well, there's a lot to be said about this little arrow right here, because it's not only the diagnosis of a fast arrhythmia, but it's also the time at which the first discrimination algorithm is working. Of course, like for most companies, we are now in the VF zone, and there is no discrimination for Microport devices in the VF zone. So no discrimination, just 6 fast events out of 8, which the other algorithm which is working also is to see whether it's in the fast VT zone and whether it's stable. But in this case, it's not a fast VT because it's just too fast. So no ATP will be attempted. And then at this time, we see, maybe if I show you a little bit later, makes it easier to understand, because we see these little C's at the bottom, and these little C's are actually the condensator which are charging. So here the first therapy is actually delivered, which is a shock in the VF zone, and of course it needs a charge of the capacitors. So this is indicated by the little C's, meaning that there is a time between the charge of the capacitors and the first time the diagnosis has been made. This is this famous persistence. So this is the delay between the diagnosis of ventricular fibrillation and the delivery of the first therapy, being a shock. So this persistence is another counter, which starts with a 1 on the moment of the diagnosis, and then a bit similar to before. So any cycles which are in that zone will increase the persistence of that zone. So this means that the VF persistence counter is here 1, and then it will be 2, 3, and it will be going all the way up until the end of the persistence, which we can check here on the parameters. And then we go not to pacing, sensing, not to body, but to tachy. And then we can appreciate there's a little bit more information on this screen than what we are used to see in the overview screen. So if we go back, here we can see that for the VF zone, the persistence, which is programmable, is 16 cycles. It's a bit funny because actually the recommendations today are 20 cycles. The maximum amount of cycles, because we have learned many things the last 10, 15 years, but one of those very important things, which Pierre has mentioned a couple of times, I'm going to repeat it anyway, is that we really try to avoid treating patients when we don't need to. We try to let non-sustained ventricular arrhythmia self-terminate. We don't want to deliver ATP because it can accelerate the rhythms and degenerate into VF. We don't want to charge the battery, the capacitors for nothing, because it takes a lot of battery energy. We don't want to deliver shocks, because patients with shocks, for VF of course, have a higher mortality than patients who did not get shocked for VT. So there's a lot of reasons why we want to have this little pause between the diagnosis and the therapy, because it just avoids a lot of unnecessary and also inappropriate shocks in case of intermittent noise and lead problems and external oversensing. So this should be 20, and I said 20. You guys are thinking, girls are thinking, why 20? Well, of course it's because it's the maximum, but it's also because it's the guidelines. You know this PDF maybe, so these are the manufacturer-specific recommendations for all companies, originally published in 2015, with update in 2019. There are really not a lot of changes between 2019 and 2015. It's really details. So you can also use the old document, but this is the new one. And it's for every company, the nominal and the settings that should be programmed for the whole group of patients are shown. So of course, also for Microport devices. And we see here that for detection in patients with no VT history, the persistence is always 20. In the VT zone, they suggest that you can also put it 30. That's what we also like to see. The longer, the better. Here we see very, very high rate for VF zone, but it's because the 230 as shown here for fast VT, that's actually already the VF zone, right? Now, the 185 is a bit similar between companies, comparable to Medtronic, always a 6 out of 8 majority. So here we see the recommended zones with the recommended persistences. Slow VT zone often used as a monitor zone. Of course, in patients who have already had VTs, we like to program such that those VTs are also treated in the future. Then for therapy, actually, there's not a lot of differences as compared to other companies. We would like to see maximum output shocks, both for VF and for VT, and they recommend to program at least one ATP, which is, of course, in our experience, we like to program a multiple ATPs for the VT zone. For discrimination, didn't talk about discrimination yet, but maybe I have some time to show you some of that later, but their discrimination algorithm is maybe a bit similar to Medtronic, where we have the PR logic really trying to couple atrial and ventricular events and trying to make sense out of the episode, trying to diagnose if it's ventricular tachycardia or even if it's supraventricular tachycardia. They really try to make a diagnosis of what type of supraventricular tachycardia it is. So if we go back to the programmer screen, so here you see how it's programmed for this patient. With the persistence should be 20. We can have a persistence which is really, really long in the VT zone, but 30 is recommended. Here we saw in the recommendations 185. And of course, bursts and ramps. Today, we're not going to discuss a lot about that, but I like to program a couple of bursts because did a study which shown that the first burst is about 63% effective. It doesn't really matter what the rate is, funny enough. And then every burst you do after has about an absolute 5%, adds 5% to the success rate. So at the end, you have almost 90% success if you have up to 6 bursts, and then the 7th or 8th bursts don't contribute anymore. So I like to program 6, but I know that many centers they program fewer ATPs, and whether those are bursts or ramps in our data sets didn't make a statistical difference. But I know that many electrophysiologists are a bit afraid of ramps because they are more aggressive. And this is also one particularity of Microport devices, is that those ATPs, you can really, really program a lot during these ATPs. So of course, you can program the number of sequences, how many cycles are added per sequence, and then the coupling interval, which is recommended to be between 80–88%. And then we can also change the way the ramp is delivered, so how fast it accelerates within the ramp, within the ATP. But we can also add rapidity between the ATPs, so making it more aggressive, the ATP after the ATP, which they call a scan. So you see, scan. So this is automatic. So if I say, okay, I want it to decrement within the ATP, it's not a burst anymore, then it's a ramp. So this is kind of, I think it's kind of smart, but don't have the experience to change this a lot, I must say. I prefer to have 6 bursts with, of course, 8 cycles, 80% or a bit slower, without decrements within the ATP or between the ATPs. And look here, you can really program it extremely aggressive, but we know from our experience that you should not deliver ATPs which are faster than 200 milliseconds. So this is a bit more about programming. So as I already said, we also have this VF zone where we have this little subzone where there is a rate and stability. So you can say, well, I don't want to check if it's stable. I've seen a VT which was quite fast, but it was a bit unstable, so it didn't deliver an ATP. Next time I wanted to deliver an ATP, then you can change it to rate only. That really doesn't shock me if you program it like this, but I think out of the box, it makes sense to program it rate and stability. Then how many ATPs? Well, most people will say that in these very, very fast zones, you should not deliver too much ATPs, not lose too much time. And I think I agree, even though if I see, I wouldn't be shocked if you would program 2 bursts. I've seen some tracings where it really helps and avoid the shock. And maybe, as you know, also in electronic devices, if you program an ATP before the shock, it actually delivers 2 ATPs because it's delivering ATP before the charge, but also during the charge. And sometimes we see that the second ATP, even though the VT is very fast, terminates the VT. But of course, the price you pay is that some arrhythmias will be accelerated during a delivery of an ATP. It's switched during very fast ventricular arrhythmia. And then maximum output shocks, of course, it's not a discussion in the VF zone. Sometimes it's a discussion in the VT zone, but in Bordeaux, it's not a discussion anymore because lower amplitude shocks are less efficacious and are more likely to accelerate the rhythm. So we don't like to see 10, 20 joule shocks anymore. So here there are some more things you can program. Of course, if you're doing the box change, this is or MRI, this is important to check. So this is the activation of the therapies, both ATP and shock. Auto switch ATP, more and more companies have this. This means that if you have a VT which has been treated by a burst and didn't work, and then after a couple of times a ramp was delivered, which was successful, then the next time it will start with the ramp. So this is what it means. Auto switch ATP just means that it will switch the sequence of ATPs when one has been more successful than the other. So I know there's a couple of companies doing that, for example, Biotronic. Then polarity alternance, well, we can also discuss a long time about that. Let's not. It means that between shocks, it will change cathode to anode, anode to cathode, because there's some indication that in some patients it may be more successful. So this is, of course, if you have dual coil lead, you need to activate this. Then you can choose also how to deliver the shock. Of course, if you don't have it, then the choices are a bit limited. So if you go back to this case, here, just a little summary. We have the first cycle, which was too slow to be in the VF zone, but then there were 6 cycles which were in the VF zone. And then there is the onset of the persistence timer, which was programmed at 16, but remember 20 is recommended. The first one is already during the diagnosis of VF. Then there is a persistence up all the way up until 16, and then which is a bit comparable to the duration in Boston Scientific devices, which is in seconds, but here it's in cycles. Then there is a charge of the capacitors, and at the end, when the persistence is higher than 16, when the cycle on delivery on the end of the charge, it still has a majority of VF. I mean, it's not shown, but actually this diagnosis of VF, this little arrow, is repeated all the time, cycle per cycle, during the persistence, during the charge of the capacitors. It's not shown because, of course, we're not interested in it because it didn't change. But if it doesn't change, it doesn't show you, but it's still doing this diagnosis and the analysis all the time. So it still needs to have this VF majority. And the cycle needs to be in the VF zone, and then it will deliver on the next R wave, as you can see here. Then a little bit funny maybe, but you can see that the onset of the first marker is a bit later. This is something we see in often in Microport devices. Of course, there is a true blanking after deliverance of the shock, because we see that these channels on the ventricle sometimes need some time to become normal electrograms. In this case, it's not very, it's not really the case, but we see that after 1 second, this ventricular event, which really looks like a ventricular event, is not sensed. That's not to do with ventricular undescending. It's just because it's in the blanking period. Though we see something which you also see sometimes, it's some kind of artifact on all the channels. So this is the first sensed event, but it's not a true event. Well, it doesn't really matter. And then it just counts. It goes, it's very similar. It uses a majority, meaning it needs 6 slow cycles out of 8 to form the diagnosis of return to slow rhythm, so SR in this case. So I think we can finalize this case. We have some time for another. Maybe I'm going to skip 2 cases because I'm talking too much, but we can go directly and discuss some discrimination. So again, there will be some explanation on how discrimination works in single chamber and dual chamber devices. But that's a bit boring maybe for now, so let's not do that. Let's just look at tracing. So here we have a patient who had a ventricular fibrillation and who had an ICD, of course. And here we see the tachogram. And of course, needs some time to for your eyes to adjust to all the nice pink colors. But here we see atrial and ventricular rate, which seem to be 1-to-1 connected. And then we see that this rhythm is going into the slow VT zone, 125, it's quite a slow zone. And then we see that there's a diagnosis made of supraventricular tachycardia, sinus tachycardia, actually. So this is what I said before. It's going to do a discrimination. It's not only trying to make the diagnosis of supraventricular, but can also really try to figure out what kind of rhythm it is. And indeed, this looks like sinus tachycardia. It looks like somebody who's doing an exercise and who has a sinus rhythm just a bit faster. It's fast enough to be in the slow VT zone. And then it slowly drifts out again. So if you look at the EGM, it just confirms what we've been thinking. So we have atrial markers, ventricular markers, and as you know, 6 out of 8 in the slow VT zone will trigger the analysis of the tracings and therefore the discrimination algorithm. And in this case, it concluded that it's a supraventricular tachycardia type sinus tachycardia. And how does that work? Well, we are reaching the end, but if you're ever wondering how it works, it's very easy. You go to this same screen under Tachy, then you click on Parrot Plus, and here you see this the algorithm popping up, which shows you how it works. And you can change the algorithm. You can say, well, this patient is in AV block, so I don't want any discrimination. So if there is a tachyarrhythmia, it's VT. But most of the cases, like in this patient, we want the full discrimination algorithm. So what it does is, I think it's quite smart. It first just looks at RR stability, because often fast conducted AF, it occurs often, and it's important for discrimination to work properly. And therefore, if RR cycles are unstable, meaning 6 out of 8 are beyond the stability criterion, which is 65 milliseconds here. And we can see we can change it. We can make it more strict or less strict. And then it's AF. Of course, in this patient, the RR intervals were stable, so it's going to go beneath to stable. Then it's going to check the association between atrial events and ventricular events. So if there's no association, so there's a fast ventricle, it's not associated, then it's ventricular tachycardia. Here there's a little detail which I'm not going to go too deep into today, but it's another check for slow cycles to check again for atrial fibrillation. This is a little plus in Parrot Plus. This is something they added. I can show you that because if I do Parrot, you don't see it. If I do Parrot Plus, then you see it. So let's say there is an association, like in this case, then it's going to check out how the association is. Is there an n-to-1 association, or is there a 1-to-1 association? Of course, if you have a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 association, it's atrial flutter. If it's a 1-to-1, then we're going to check how the acceleration is working. And of course, there are some pitfalls here, but still, most often it works quite nicely. And also, this percentage of acceleration is something you can program. It's also different between single and dual leads. So you can program it higher in younger patients who are better, who have faster acceleration, also doing sinus rhythm. So if you see problems, you can change it. And of course, in this case, we're going here. So it's a gradual acceleration, and it's sinus tachycardia. But let's just finish up and say, okay, it has been a sudden acceleration. Now, what is there left to see? Now, that's all the atrial tachycardias. This is quite smart, I think, to look at the origin of the acceleration. Not a lot of companies do that. Of course, you need good atrial sensing for that, and not functional undersensing problems as well. But still, this I've seen many tracings where this works very nicely. So meaning that if it started in the atrium, then it's atrial tachycardia. So this is actually how we are also looking at EGMs. But if it started in the ventricle, then of course it's VT. So that is in short the algorithm of discrimination in Microport devices. Don't think we don't have time anymore to show more tracings, but I hope you appreciate a little bit and learned a little bit more about Microport ICDs. I know there are some French colleagues looking today, so I want to show them that since this morning, it's also possible to switch to French on the side. So you see the little flag on top. And I think we'll add more languages in the future, probably Italian and Japanese. Don't think Dutch will be one of the major priorities, but you see in French, we hope to get reach more and more people, and therefore you can play around and see if you find any mistakes in French, please let me know. So with that, I would like to conclude for today. I don't know if Pierre is around and has any questions. I don't know if anybody has any questions out there.
No question.
No questions?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Have a great day. Pierre, do you already know what we're going to discuss next week?
Nope.
Okay, so we'll let you know on social media what we are up to, but we'll be there next week, same time on Monday, right?
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.